There's a decision sitting inside you that hasn't been said out loud yet. You know what it is. You know who needs to hear it. You've just been finding reasons to wait. Those reasons are running out. So here's what's happening right now. Mercury and Mars are meeting up in the last degrees of Pisces, right before they both move into Aries in a few days. Think of it as the moment where knowing something and actually doing something about it finally collide. And keeping it inside past this point, it starts to feel heavier than just saying it. Here's the thing. Having this conversation while they're still in Pisces is gentle. Once they're in Aries, same words but harder edges. The decision doesn't change. The tone of it does. Nothing needs to be figured out. That part's done. It's just about saying the thing to the right person, while the soft version of this conversation is still on the table. So let's be specific about what this actually feels like, because it's not dramatic. It doesn't keep you up at night in an obvious way. It's more like a low background hum, a thing that's just always slightly present. You're in a conversation about something else, and it's there underneath. You're doing something routine, and it surfaces for a second. You push it back down. Not because you're afraid exactly, just because the moment doesn't feel right yet. And that's been happening for a few days now. Since the beginning of this week, something shifted. A direction became clearer, a sense that what you've been sitting with is actually real and not just something you've been turning over in your head. That clarity didn't make it easier to say. If anything, it made the not saying heavier, because you can't pretend anymore that you're still working out what you think. You know what you think. You just haven't handed it to the other person yet. That's the specific weight, not confusion, not fear, just an unsaid thing that knows it's unsaid. And here's what's true about that kind of weight. It doesn't stay the same size. Every day it sits inside unsaid. It gets a little denser, a little harder to hold comfortably. The reasons you've been using to wait haven't disappeared, but they've gotten thinner, less convincing. The not the right moment excuse used to have more room in it than it does right now. That's not accidental. That's what's happening in the sky right now. Two planets. The one that governs thought and words, and the one that governs will and action, are meeting up today. In the last stretch of a sign that makes words soft and intuitive before both of them move into a sign where that softness is completely gone. The window for the gentle version of this conversation is open right now, and it doesn't stay open past the next few days. To understand why this week specifically built to this point, and why the beginning of the week was the start of this, not a separate thing, you need to see the sequence that got you here. So this didn't come out of nowhere. This week built to this point in a specific sequence, and it's worth seeing it clearly because it explains why the weight has been growing and why today is where it lands. Earlier this week, 3 planets lined up in a clean formation: Moon, Jupiter, Mercury, all in water signs, all supporting each other. And what that did specifically was take the thing you'd been sitting with since the winter and confirm it. Not create it, confirm it. The direction became real. The sense that what you've been thinking and feeling and holding quietly was actually grounded in something that landed. And with that confirmation came a shift. The unsaid thing wasn't just a feeling anymore. It was a position. And positions are harder to keep inside than feelings are. Then the pressure changed character. The Sun in Aries pushing forward, Jupiter in Cancer asking whether you're actually ready. That tension ran through a whole day, not about the decision itself, but about the gap between having it and expressing it. You could feel the friction but couldn't point to an exact source. That was the gap between seeing clearly and not having moved yet. Then, just a day or so after that, Venus and Ceres met up in the early afternoon. And this is the part people tend to miss. That conjunction did something specific. It made obvious not just what needs to be said, but who needs to hear it. If there was any lingering ambiguity about the right person or the right relationship this applies to. That afternoon clarified it. The conversation stopped being abstract. It got an address. So by the time today arrived, 3 things were already in place. The decision was confirmed as real. The pressure of not acting on it had built, and the who and the what had become specific. Today, Mercury and Mars meet in the last degrees of Pisces. Mercury is the planet of thought, words, communication, the thing that takes what's inside and makes it expressible. Mars is will, drive, the thing that moves you from knowing to doing. When they meet, the gap between the internal and the external gets smallest. The thing that's been living only inside you has the most direct path outward that it's had all week. That's the sequence. Each step removed one layer of the reason to wait. The first step removed, I'm not sure what I think. The next removed, I'm not sure it's real. Then, I'm not sure who this is about. And today removes the last one. I'm not sure how to say it. You don't need to know how. Mercury and Mars together in the same place today. That's the how. The words are available right now in a form they won't be available in a few days from now. And that specific shift, what changes when both of them move into Aries, is the part that actually matters for understanding why today is the soft window and not just another day in the same stretch. So here's what's actually happening today and why this specific moment is different from anything earlier this week. Mercury and Mars are meeting at 28 degrees of Pisces. That's the last stretch of the sign, 2 degrees from the edge before both of them cross into Aries. And that position matters more than it sounds. Planets in the final degrees of a sign carry the full concentrated quality of that sign before it ends. Mercury, at 28 Pisces, is Mercury at its most intuitive. Words come from feeling, not from logic. You don't need to construct the sentence carefully. It arrives. Mars at 28 Pisces is Mars at its most fluid. The push toward action is there, but it moves through the body like a current rather than a shove. Gentle pressure, not a hard edge. When these two meet at this exact point, thought and will, words and drive, in this exact quality, something that's been sitting inside you finds the lowest possible resistance to coming out. That's the window, and it's open right now, this morning, through midday. There's also something worth knowing about what happens earlier today before the conjunction goes exact. The sun and the moon are in a trine, a clean, supportive angle. The sun in Aries, the moon still in Sagittarius, both fire signs. What that does in practical terms is make words easier. The tone of a conversation that starts this morning has a natural lightness to it that isn't forced. Things that are hard to say come out less hard than expected. That's not a metaphor. It's just what a fire trine between sun and moon does to communication. So the window is actually two-layered. The morning has the easiest tone. Midday has the exact conjunction. The peak of Mercury and Mars in the same place. Between those two is probably the most naturally supported stretch for this conversation that exists right now. After exact, the conjunction begins separating. The two planets start to move apart. The energy doesn't disappear, but the sharpest point of it passes. And in a few days, both Mercury and Mars cross into Aries. And that's where the quality of the conversation changes. Not the content, the quality. Aries doesn't soften things. It doesn't leave room for nuance or for feeling out the right words as you go. Mars in Aries is direct. It says the thing plainly and without cushion. Mercury in Aries thinks fast and speaks faster. The same decision, the same sentence. But the version of you that says it in Aries says it with harder edges than the version of you that says it right now. Neither is wrong, but they land differently on the person hearing it. What makes today the soft version isn't that the decision is softer. It's that the medium carrying it is. Pisces holds space for the human weight of what's being said. Aries doesn't have the same patience for that. And why the shift after Aries matters practically, not just in tone, but in what it means for the relationship or situation on the other side of this conversation. That's what hasn't been said yet. So here's what actually changes when Mars moves into Aries in a few days, and why it matters for the specific thing you're holding. The first thing is speed. Mars in Aries doesn't wait for the right moment. It moves when it's ready, which is basically always. The internal pressure you've been feeling this week, that low hum of, "this needs to be said," in Aries, that pressure doesn't stay low. It rises. And it rises in a way that other people around you start to notice, not just you. The second thing is tone. And this is the practical one. Right now, in Pisces, the decision you're carrying can come out as, "I want to talk to you about something." It can start with context, with how you got here, with the human texture of what you've been sitting with. Pisces allows for that. It actually supports it. Words in a water sign carry feeling with them naturally, without extra effort. In Aries, the same decision comes out as the decision, directly, without the preamble. Not cruel, just efficient. And efficient isn't always what a conversation needs to land well, especially if the other person needs a moment to receive what you're saying before you get to the core of it. The hook puts it plainly: same words, harder edges. That's not an abstraction. That's the practical difference between a conversation that the other person can actually hear and one where the delivery gets in the way of the content. And here's the part that people don't usually think about. The person on the other end of this conversation is also inside this shift. They're going to feel Mars in Aries too, which means their ability to receive something softly, to sit with it, to respond without immediately reacting. That also changes. The window for a conversation that both people can be present for is the same window you have for saying it gently. After that window, it's not that the conversation can't happen, it's that it happens under different conditions. More pressure on both sides, less room for the texture that makes hard things land without becoming harder. The ending says it directly. There's no neutral position between now and then. That's not a threat. It's just mechanics. Mars in Aries picks up everything that's in motion and accelerates it. The decision you're carrying right now is in motion whether you say it or not. It has been since earlier this week when the direction became real. The question isn't whether it moves, it's whether you're the one who decides how it moves, or whether the pace just takes it from here. Saying it today, while Mercury and Mars are still in the soft part of this, is you deciding. Waiting until after the shift is still a decision, but it's one made under more pressure and with fewer options for how it sounds. The conversation itself doesn't need to be long. It doesn't need to be perfectly worded. It doesn't need a plan. What it needs is the one sentence that names the actual thing. Not the preamble, not the context, not the history. The thing itself. And what happens when that sentence exists in the real world between two people, rather than just inside one person, is what changes everything about what comes next. Here's what actually happens when you say it. Not what you're imagining might happen, not the version you've been running in your head where it goes sideways or lands wrong or creates a problem that wasn't there before. Just what actually happens mechanically when a decision that's been inside one person becomes a real thing between two people. It gets edges. Right now, it's shapeless. And shapeless things are actually harder to carry than people realize because they fill whatever container you put them in. They expand to fit the space. The unsaid decision you've been carrying this week has been filling your whole internal space in a way that something with clear edges wouldn't. It's been present in conversations it has nothing to do with. It's been there when you wake up. It's been the background frequency underneath everything else. Once it's said, it has a specific shape. It's this thing between these two people, in this relationship or situation. It stops being everything and becomes something. And something, even if it's uncomfortable, is easier to deal with than everything. The ending names it exactly. It existed before, but inside it stays shapeless. Once it's out, it becomes a real thing that takes up real space. Real space is smaller than the space a shapeless thing fills. That's the practical reason to say it. Not because it resolves everything immediately, but because it stops expanding. And there's something else that happens when it's out. The other person gets to be part of it. Right now, you're carrying this alone, which means you're also managing their imagined reaction, their imagined response, the imagined version of the conversation, all by yourself. That's actually more weight than the real conversation. The real conversation has two people in it. The imagined one only has you. Now, the question about what comes after this conversation and what the next cycle looks like once the decision is in the real world, that's where new moon in Aries comes in. It's coming in about 10 days, and what that new moon does is start a fresh cycle. But the cycle it starts depends entirely on what's already in motion by then. New moons in Aries are ignition points. They don't create what you have. They accelerate what's there. If the decision is already out in the real world by then, the new cycle starts from that new reality. The relationship, the situation, the dynamic, it builds from the honest version of things. If the decision is still inside, the new cycle starts with the same weight still being carried, under Mars in Aries pressure, which means it comes out anyway, just faster and with less room for how it sounds. 10 days isn't a long window, and between now and then, the soft version of this conversation is only available for the next day or two, while Mercury and Mars are still in the last degrees of Pisces. After that, the edges are already there, whether you put them there or not, which brings it down to one thing, one sentence, and what to do with it before today is over. So here's what today actually asks of you, and it's less than you think. Not a prepared speech, not a difficult confrontation, not a plan for every possible response. Just one sentence that names the actual thing. Not the context around it, not the history that led to it, not the qualifications and softeners you'd add to make it easier to receive. The thing itself. One sentence. You already know what that sentence is. You've known it for days. It's been sitting right there underneath everything else. The thing you'd say if you weren't thinking about how it lands, if you weren't managing the imagined reaction, if you just said what's true. That sentence is what Mercury and Mars together today are built for. Mercury takes what's inside and makes it speakable. Mars gives it the small push needed to actually come out. In Pisces, right now, today, that combination is soft. The sentence arrives with the human weight of what it actually is, not hard, not sharp, just real. There are 3 things worth holding on to between now and tonight. First, don't prepare. Preparation for a conversation like this is almost always a way of staying inside it longer without actually having it. You don't need a script. You need the one sentence. Start there and let Mercury and Mars carry the rest. That's literally what today is for. Second, the morning through midday is the easiest stretch. Earlier today, the sun and moon were in a supportive angle. Fire signs both, which makes tone lighter and words easier. That quality carries into the early afternoon. If there's a moment today that feels natural, that's not an accident. That's the window. Third, start with the sentence. Not, I've been thinking about something. Not, can we talk? The sentence. The actual one. Because the preamble is where most of these conversations stall. People talk around the thing for so long that the other person gets defensive before the real thing even arrives. The soft version of this conversation starts with the thing itself in Pisces, where it lands with weight but without armor. That's it. That's the whole protocol. Not because you have to, not because something bad happens if you don't, but because you've been carrying this for days, and the carrying has cost more than the saying will. And because the version of this conversation that's available right now, gentle, with room for the human texture of what you mean, closes in a day or two. After that, the same decision. Different temperature. It was said, or it wasn't. Either way, the part where you could keep it quietly to yourself is getting harder to maintain. And you can feel that. What's different now is that the decision has edges. It existed before, but inside it stays shapeless. Once it's out, it becomes a real thing that takes up real space. In a few days, Mars moves into Aries and the whole pace shifts. What you said this weekend, or didn't, meets that momentum directly. There's no neutral position between now and then. Subscribe and stay close.